So the main question I got when people heard I was going to moderate this morning was, how did you get this gig? I'm very delighted. And they said, especially because your name is Nancy. There were dozens of questions for you. Abigail has not heard any of these questions. We just let her know that we were going to be talking about her 5 careers and talking about these pieces. A number of you did ask questions about the political situation right now. Abigail's going to take the last 5 minutes of our talk to speak to some of the current events that are going on and her view on it, so that you will get some of those answers as well today. So Abigail, we know that you went to Tucker High School. Are there any dreams, driving forces, authorities during your growing up years that influenced you for your 5 careers? In other words, when all of us were thinking about being firefighters, what were you thinking about?
So I always wanted to work for the CIA. I used to write my diary in code. I got burned once because my sister, who was a couple years younger, couldn't read and took my diary to the next door neighbor to have the next door neighbor read it to her, and that didn't go well for me. I mean, I was in 5th grade, and so then I learned my lesson. You got to keep secrets better than that, so I started writing my diary in code. But I was always really interested in answering questions and kind of finding things out. I loved Nancy Drew, I suppose, from when I was a little kid. So that was always the kind of overarching interest. And when you dream of being a CIA officer, you don't really have any real role models in that. So, but I was always intrigued by Margaret Thatcher. And I thought she was amazing. I remember seeing her always with Ronald Reagan, just thinking that was the coolest thing. And I loved answering questions and understanding foreign cultures. I had a babysitter who was originally from Ecuador when I was a child growing up. And I thought it was so cool that they could speak other languages, that this woman could speak another language with her grandkids. So that really is what got me intrigued. And then when I was in middle school, I was part of a childhood language acquisition study for children studying Chinese. And it just sort of rolled from there. And by the time I got to high school, I was interested in politics, I was interested in foreign affairs, and I just always believed that CIA would be the right way for me to go about kind of staying under the radar and answering questions, which were kind of the things I liked to do at the time.
Great, thank you.
She says on a stage in front of a lot of people.
The irony was not lost on us. We are told that those graduating now will have 10 to 12 jobs and 3 to 4 careers, and you're firmly on that trajectory. You began your career of public service as a federal law enforcement officer working narcotics and money laundering.
That's right.
With the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Why did you begin there? And was there anything that surprised you about the role, or was a big learning?
So the way that kind of transpired was I was in Germany getting my MBA when 9/11 happened. And my whole goal had been, I'm going to get my MBA in Germany, I'm going to live in Germany for a number of years, perfect my German, move home, join the CIA, after I've had this kind of international business experience and my German is better. But after 9/11, I started thinking, if this is what I want to be doing in 5 years, why wouldn't I do it now? And so I finished my program. I graduated with my degree. It was a dual degree program between this German university and Purdue's Cranert School. And so after I finished my MBA, I immediately moved to DC and started applying with federal agencies, top among them and on my list being CIA. So I applied with CIA in September, and then I got a job offer from them in December. And it was a conditional offer contingent upon a background check, medical, psych evals, all those sorts of things. And so I continued with some of my other federal employment opportunities, but this is where I wanted to be. And so as I moved along in the process, I actually withdrew from the FBI's process, from the State Department's process. And now as an adult, I'm horrified that, I was kind of putting all of my eggs in one basket. And my very wise father said, don't put all of your eggs in one basket. And so I did continue with the process with the Postal Inspection Service because my father was a career postal inspector. He worked fraud cases for the entirety of his career and loved his job. And so I kept my application with them. And at that point in time, they, I was going through this process. You might have heard I was a substitute teacher for a while as well.
A little bit.
And so then the Postal Inspection Service, they cleared me and brought me on. And in the end, it was an incredible experience because I always knew I wanted to go to CIA, but in the end, my background check process with CIA took close to 4 years. So I ended up spending 2.5 years working narcotics and money laundering cases, which was an incredibly interesting experience. I worked in the DC area. I was on the high intensity drug trafficking area task force. So I worked a lot with Metropolitan PD and DC. I worked a lot with Baltimore Police Department because my territory was Baltimore to DC and some Northern Virginia. So I worked with Maryland State Police a ton on joint cases. And it was an incredible experience, particularly as a young professional, to have the opportunity to be in all of these circumstances, all of these situations where there's so many levels of responsibility. I'm an armed law enforcement officer walking in to do a drug arrest or quite literally knocking down the doors. Well, I was usually fourth in the lineup, knocking down the doors. And running in, securing the place, being responsible for all of those kind of everything that happens in an arrest in these federal investigations. And it was just a tremendous learning experience, a tremendous, really formative experience, particularly for a young professional. Additionally speaking, I'm a Spanish speaker, so when we did have drug arrests where it was known that the individuals didn't speak any English or might have limited English, I was always there. I was also one of the only women on my team. Well, I was the only woman on my team. And so when there were women in the house, as there frequently were in some of our drug arrests, it was always, I then became responsible for the women in the home. And so just that, the amount of engagement that you have in sometimes people's darkest points, it was really an incredibly informative position for me to be in, particularly having grown up in the suburbs and having very little access to really challenging circumstances and people who find themselves in bad positions by virtue of who else lives in their home, and then of course those who are making really terrible decisions.
Wow, right. So then your next career, your second career, the CIA. It worked out that you had all your eggs in one basket, right? Yeah. So were there any stories about your background checks or your training or your assignments that were really interesting that you can tell us?
So there's, going through the process, I did work undercover for my time with the agency, and I did go through the process of getting my employment declassified. And I went through that process because in 2014, we moved back to Virginia, and this, I guess you'll probably get to this in your list. And I initially wasn't planning on getting my employment declassified. I thought, I'll just continue telling people what I've always told people. It's even of less consequence after I'm kind of back in my hometown. But I got my resume cleared from my cover job, and it was basically, she showed up to work. Which in fairness, when you do that job like 10% of the time, that's about as good as it gets. And so I actually went through the process of getting my employment declassified because of the fact that I wanted to be able to have a good resume that actually spoke to some of my skill set. And in the end, it worked out because Stan mentioned I had a good job. I got a great job. I work with Royal & Company, and actually Bill and Pam Royal are in the audience as well. So. But part of it was getting that employment declassified. So when people ask me about what it is I'm allowed to talk about, I'm actually really well versed in kind of the parameters of what I'm allowed to talk about because I had to go through this whole process. I had to get my website cleared by the agency before I could put up my campaign website. So good stories. It's a funny thing because, here's a good one. I was talking with my mother-in-law. My husband's an engineer. He works on satellite systems. And I was talking with my mother-in-law shortly after we were married, and I was with CIA at that point. And my mother-in-law said, well, Adam's an engineer. I said, yeah, I know. And he works on satellite systems. Yeah, I know. And he had a job an internship with the NSA. Yeah, I'm aware. And she said, well, everybody thinks he works at CIA. And I said, really? And she said, yes. I mean, we don't talk about it, but everybody thinks he works at CIA. And I said, oh, I don't think he works at CIA. And she said, oh, I don't know. And so about 10 years later when I said, surprise, I guess it was 8 years later. That was a funny moment, so.
That's great, thank you.
There's a lot of talk right now about walls, about building them. But what the arts does, it breaks them down. I have never seen anything as effective in breaking down barriers between cultures, between generations, between people with different beliefs. It's amazing. Once you learn what's behind a culture or a generation, as far as their art goes, you begin to appreciate the people behind it. That's what the arts do.
We had loved the fact that our home leave location was the same place, and so unlike so many other people in the Foreign Service or with CIA who have to kind of divide their time, we thought this is the easiest path. We can just go back to Richmond and then go out to wherever else we're going to be. But it really got us thinking, and so in 2014, we really decided to just try something different, and we committed to let's do 5 years. 5 years if we don't like being back in Virginia, if the private sector doesn't work for me, like I can go back to CIA, that'll be fine. And so, 5 years seemed like a good chunk of time. It makes the investment in buying a house worth it, all of those sorts of things. And by the way, we hit 5 years this August, so we'll see what happens. But, and so I started looking around for companies, and coming out of a job that I deeply, deeply loved, that was a complete lifestyle, that really informed in an interesting way every aspect of how I engaged with people. It was a job I was driven to do that I made a ton of sacrifices for. I didn't want to just get a job. And so I spent a lot of time having coffees and meeting with people. I also had the benefit of, well, you could call it a benefit, of my background check, or my background clearance process, where they were, the process of declassifying my job with CIA took about 9 or 10 months. So I had about 9 or 10 months when I didn't have a real resume, and it was a lot of just getting to know people throughout the Richmond area. And through a number of links, I was made aware of Royal & Company. And it was a very interesting company from my perspective, having spent 0 time in the private sector, because the focus was really on relationships. And so with CIA, everything is a relationship. Because when you're asking someone to commit espionage on behalf of the United States government, when you are asking someone to risk his or her life to tell you vital information that might really drive American policy, they have to trust you. They may not like you, they may not have anything else in common with you, but they have to trust you. And so one of the things that I found so interesting about Royal & Company is that it was such a relationship-based company where, I in my position there was working directly with colleges and universities, helping them meet their recruitment goals, and engineering schools that wanted more women, or state schools that wanted more out-of-state kids, and schools that wanted more racial or geographic diversity. But they have to trust you, and they have to believe and understand that you know why it is that they're trying to affect this change within on their campus. And so for me, when I found out about the company, when I spent some time there, the fact that from start to finish it's a relationship-focused company, it was a very good fit for me. So that's where I started in the private sector. And I do have one funny story. One time we had an error. Our team messed up and sent something out on behalf of the clients that it wasn't a huge issue, but one of the men on my team comes in like pale and kind of frantic, and he tells me about this mistake that happened. And he's kind of stammering a little bit, and I said, okay. And I guess I didn't really react very much. And so he leaves, and somebody comes back and tells me that he's just flipping out, worried, beside himself, just so upset. And evidently he thought my calm was just anger. So he's freaking out because he thinks I'm freaking out. So I call him into my office and I said, listen, we're gonna have to have a conversation about this. Like, I'm the one who has to call the client and say we made this mistake, so I don't know what you're freaking out about. And secondly, it's something we can fix, right? And thirdly, nobody's in prison in Iran. So from my perspective, this is okay. And so that was a little bit of a lesson to me, actually, to be a little bit more empathetic towards towards sometimes employees who have an entirely different perspective of what's a big deal.
Very good, thank you. Then your fourth career, running for office, and as Stan alluded to earlier, it really is the ultimate startup, right? You start from having nothing except your will to do it, right? We know that you were advised by friends, family, as well as national organizations such as Emily's List and Citizens United on running for office. What was the most amazing advice you received while you were exploring this possibility and during your campaign?
So two things. When I was deciding whether or not to run, I reached out to pretty much everyone who knew me from different aspects of my life, including really good friends of mine who are very strong Republicans, because I wanted their perspective. And so a very good friend of mine who I've known since college, who we've had long and aggravating conversations about politics over the years, it mattered to me what he thought. And so I reached, in particular, he gave me very good advice. And then another person who gave me really good advice is my brother-in-law, who's actually here, so not to embarrass him, but because people will tell you, and you mentioned some of the organizations, they'll say, do this and do that, and you want to seem this way, and you want to do this. But my very dear friend, who generally often disagrees with me on politics, and my brother-in-law, who sometimes disagrees with me on politics, gave me the advice, which is, we believe in you, and we know who you are. And so every time that you can convey who you are, and every time you are you, that is what you need to do. And it was advice that at times I went up against the Democratic Party. At times Emily's List wasn't happy with me. And even in terms of some of the choices that we made, people advised against them. But if I am going to demonstrate time and time again who I am and what it is that I want to do with this campaign, this is what we're doing. And so it seems trite almost to say kind of be yourself, but I think in politics so frequently people wait for poll results to kind of hone their message or shift what they say, when politics, it's about relationships, and you're asking people to trust you, and they may never ever meet you. And so if you're kind of some concocted version of you, then many people aren't that's not who I want in elected office. And so it was very important to me to kind of fundamentally just do what I believed is right, and every time I could convey who I truly am, try to do that as best as possible.
Great, thank you. So we got a lot of questions.
Okay, I'll stop giving such long answers.
No, it was real. No, I was going to say a lot of questions on this particular next question. One of the most iconic moments of the November 2018 election, and not just locally, social media went wild, was when your daughter crawled between your legs while you were giving your thank you and here we go speech after learning you had been elected. Many women in particular found this an incredibly inspiring moment. Can you tell us about that moment and what went through your head at that time?
So I was standing, for those of you who didn't see the picture, I was standing at a podium speaking, and my husband and my 3 daughters were behind me, and one of our family friends, a little girl. So there's my husband and 4 little girls. And my 4-year-old kind of wanders over to me, and I hear Adam saying, Catherine, desperate to get her back, but up on stage, so trying not to make a move. And she comes and sits on my feet, which is something she actually always frequently does. She likes to sit on my feet. So she came and sat on my feet, and then she got bored and started playing between my legs. And I just kept talking because she so frequently does this to me. I might be on the phone or on a conference call or even stirring the spaghetti, and she's kind of sitting on my feet. And And so I didn't really think anything of that, apart from the fact that internally I was chuckling because my husband was clearly having a heart attack. Just trying to smile and get her back. But then at one point she actually tugged on me that she wanted me to pick her up. And that's when I had a moment where I thought, kind of back to those, how do people interpret women running for office and when they have kids and what does it seem like, and my kids are young, and I tried to keep my kids out of the spotlight for really a long time. And for anyone who was paying attention, there were no photographs, nothing of them until January, when I really knew that the campaign was in a serious spot, because I knew that once there was any even photographic evidence of kind of who they are, that we couldn't walk back and give them back their privacy. But so in addition to that, I'd also been sensitive to the fact that how are people going to perceive me as a candidate with these young children. I know the balance in my life, I know the dynamic in my family, but I certainly didn't want anyone to have opinions of that might make an incorrect judgment of my ability to do the job. So when she was tugging on me, wanting me to pick her up, I thought, oh my goodness, I can't pick up my kid while I'm out at a campaign event. And then I thought, oh, that's right, I just won. And so I picked her up.
Beautiful, thank you. Fifth career, serving in office. What a different job description that is. Harry in our group wonders if when arriving in DC you had that Dorothy of the Wizard of Oz moment, Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. Many are very curious about what orientation and the first few weeks of the newly elected Congress is like. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Sure. Well, there's this moment where you build a campaign, a multi-million-dollar campaign, a business, and there's volunteers, and there's hundreds of people, and everybody's involved, and all of a sudden it ends in one day. And then you have to get rid of your office space and all of the stuff, and you just dial everything down. That in and of itself is a really tremendous experience, but in the same time, you have to all of a sudden ramp up, and now you're hiring people for your official staff. So election was a Tuesday, and the following Monday, we went to DC as part of orientation, and we have so many new members. And they bring us, we show up at this hotel, and there's press everywhere. They have them all cordoned off, and I was actually with Neil's daughter. She went up as our staff member for orientation. So we drive up, and there's all this press outside, and we thought, oh, like, what do we do with the car? How do we handle this? Do we valet? I mean, like the minor logistics, but it's very much a turning point. And so from that point in time, we have to hire a new staff. And one of the things that I did not know is that every congressional office is essentially like a small business. There's no coordinated HR function within the House of Representatives. You file all the paperwork. You actually have to request your trash cans for your office, which we found out. One gentleman walked in today and commented that our staff, we must have hired senior staffers because we already have business cards. I mean, which is an absolutely true thing. There are so many things that until you actually say, well, how do you get your business card? Like there's no kind of process for some of these things. But orientation was very interesting. We had a week of orientation right before Thanksgiving, and it was all the new members. It was a lot of classes and events and more events. We had a lot of the ethics training and the harassment training and the how do you start a new office training. That was all done in a bipartisan manner. But a lot of the events were divided. And in fact, even one morning we went out and there was a Republican bus and a Democratic bus. And it wasn't intentional bipartisanship on my part. I just got on the wrong bus. But I did make some Republican friends pretty early on because of that. Which also, the Democratic bus is really crowded, so. So that was a nice way to level it out with people. But the training's really, it was interesting, and they just sort of drop you into it. And then from there, and it's interesting because you don't really you're meeting all of the other new members, you're trying to get a gauge for what sort of legislative priorities people have. Then we did a week, 3 days of training at Harvard. Their School of Public Policy hosts an event, a bipartisan event, which was actually the best bipartisan event that we had, where it was just day-long briefings on a variety of different topics. They brought in speakers from across the country, and that was really valuable. I'm glad that I went to that, partially because the information itself was of value, but also because you do spend a lot of time with other new members and start to form those relationships. Then we had another week of orientation back in DC, and then we showed up in January. And in the process, in that interim time, I mean, I was doing interviews for staff members. We hired a chief of staff. We hired a legislative director. We hired an operations officer, an executive officer. We hired our district director. And so it is an interesting time because you're ramping down a campaign and closing everything out, and you're ramping up a congressional office. And we got our keys to the office January 2nd. You get your keys to the office, so you move in, and swearing in day was January 3rd. So it really flips very, very quickly. I think that we've done a great job of hiring up a staff. I feel like we're in a good place. I've already co-sponsored 10 pieces of legislation, and we've been kind of rocking and rolling on that side of things. But certainly it is a lot that occurs in that very short window of time. And there's a number of things where if you don't know what you don't know until you walk into your office and you don't have trash cans. And then they say, well, you haven't requested them yet, for example. But it's been very interesting. And of course, the shutdown, entering Congress in a place where the government is partially shut down, it changes the dynamic entirely. It's all we talk about. Many of us want to be talking about healthcare and prescription drug prices and infrastructure and broadband internet, and we were talking about all of those things up until the middle of December, and now it is how do we end the shutdown, and that's been a real challenge too for new members as we're trying to determine kind of what's our lane, how can we impact change. I'm certainly not. I'm not the one who has negotiating power, so where can I use my voice in a powerful way? How can I advocate for the people of Virginia? And certainly we are one of the states that is most impacted by the shutdown. And everywhere I go, I hear horrible, tragic, scary stories, not just about the individual experience, but from the air traffic controllers who are talking about their real legitimate fears of having people working 6 days a week, 10-hour days and not getting paid. Bureau of Prisons saying, we have people in dangerous situations in federal prisons not getting paid. They're getting taunted by prisoners. This cannot continue. And so I think that's really changed the dynamic of what it is to enter Congress in the 116th. And you may have additional questions about that, so I'll stop there.
So I have one question that was one of the most asked questions, and then we'll have you turn to some of the more current day things that you're dealing with. Many asked, how can we help?
So I think that how people can help is there is a level of divisiveness that I think has become so pervasive and so detrimental. It's one of the reasons why I ran for Congress. It's frankly one of the reasons why I won, that people have so frequently said that really the way we ran our campaign was enough to win a vote for someone who might not normally vote for a Democrat. And so the way that people can help is a couple things. When there's an issue that you care about, please contact our office. It seems more formal to do it online than via direct email, but we actually have, and we're building out our team of our legislative team. So on any issues, I ask that you give your ideas online through that portal, because then we can flag it and tag different legislative folks and route it that way and have a record of how we follow up. But I think in the day-to-day, wherever we can try and tone down the divisiveness and some of the rhetoric, and I'm a Democrat. I've always been a Democrat. I have very strong opinions about a lot of things, but I think that I also have a responsibility to talk about them in a measured and civil way. That may not be how I talk about them after the kids are in bed and my husband and I are drinking a glass of wine. But I think out in the public sphere, so many of us, people who are business leaders or community leaders, or just who have a loud voice within their peer group, I think there's a lot that we could be doing to bring our larger community back together, and the conversation, the political discussion back to a place where it's a little bit less partisan and a little bit less angry. And frankly, I think that when we're looking long-term about civic engagement, people who decide to vote or not vote, one of the things that I found really shocking and sad was across the campaign trail, so many people said politics is just it's so angry, it's so this, insert any long laundry list of negative adjectives, and I don't want to be a part of it. And I think that we as a country suffer when more and more people decide that they want to be outside of the political spectrum, because it's become this anger place where people just argue. So I think wherever we can take action to reclaim that and have conversations with people that we disagree with and say, listen, we're probably going to disagree about this, but let's at least kind of come to the table. And I'm not saying you have to have political conversations all the time, but I think wherever we can pull it back into a place of, we could agree to disagree, as opposed to we can never talk about politics because, it'll be a screaming match. Honestly, the more that we can get to a place where people can have conversations where they disagree in a more respectful manner, I think the better it is for the country. That's not to say don't be passionate. That's not to say don't be, an engaged advocate or activist or however you want to term it. But really try to take it out of that personal space, so that when we're fighting for things and we're not just fighting people, which I think is where we've fallen the past couple of years.
Great. How would you like And what else would you like to share with the group today?
Yeah, so I know there's some questions about the shutdown, so I'll just address that. So as I'm sure you're aware, the shutdown started in December, and it's a partial shutdown, so it impacts specific government entities, so it is not every federal employee, but the major ones that are impacted, Customs and Border Patrol, most of their employees are currently working without pay. Federal Bureau of Prisons employees are working without pay or furloughed. HUD employees, predominantly furloughed, which means anyone who requires engagement with HUD can't get that. A lot of veterans, a lot of elderly, a lot of families with children who rely on HUD resources. So air traffic controllers working without pay, directing airplanes through the skies. So the Airline Pilots Association, for example, has been really adamant about we need to end the shutdown because they're truly concerned about it from a public safety standpoint. TSA, so starting salary for a lot of TSA agents, $17,000 a year, and now they're working without pay. And you want to talk about paycheck to paycheck. If you make $17,000 a year, that's a paycheck to paycheck life, and they have now missed a month's pay, but yet they show up to work because they believe in what they do. It's just heartbreaking. And so the shutdown that started in the 115th, at that time, the Senate voted by voice vote, so recorded unanimous, but it was voice vote, to pass a funding bill that would have funded the government through September for most of the agencies, through February for Homeland Security, allowing it would have allowed us more time to kind of hash out some of the arguments related to border security and what that means. At the time, then Speaker Paul Ryan refused to take it up for a vote on the House floor. By all accounts, it would have passed. So January 3rd, we were all sworn in, and we took up the same bill that the Senate side had already voted on, that had already passed. We took up the same bill, House version. We voted for it. It passed with Republican support, and then Mitch McConnell on the Senate side refused to take it up. And so the shutdown continued from there. We have since voted a total of 9 times. One of the votes was vacated, so on record 8, but we've technically voted now 9 times to open either all of the shutdown portions of the government or some of the agencies under the premise that, okay, if we're going to continue to fight about Homeland Security, let's at least fund HUD, let's at least fund Department of the Interior, let's at least fund some of these other agencies and departments. And each time it's passed on the House side with Republican support. There's growing Republican support, but on the Senate side, McConnell has refused to bring it to a floor vote. And so there's been a real significant issue there because we keep voting and they're not taking it up, which is the exact opposite of what happened in December. Last week I did go to the White House as part of a bipartisan group to meet with the president. And that came about. I was invited to Monday night. I got an invitation to go meet with the president, and it turned out that there were other Democrats who were declining for scheduling purposes or whatever reasons their invitations. And so I got looped in with some of them because there was going to be 9 Republicans and potentially just me. And so I had said, listen, I said I would talk to anyone, including the president, on the campaign trail, but can I please go in a bipartisan group? And so there were, I got wind of the fact that there was another group that was going, and so I asked if they wouldn't mind me coming on the Wednesday, I guess, instead. So it got reported that I had turned him down. I hadn't turned him down. I had just asked to come the next day. And so I did go as part of this bipartisan group. I think it was 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats. And we went and had what I felt was a fairly productive meeting. It clearly wasn't that productive because the government still shut down, but there's a lot more contributing factors. It was a very good conversation. I was able to talk directly with the Commissioner of Customs and Border Patrol about some issues related to border funding that they've been requesting, and make clear to the president the tremendous impact that the shutdown is having on the very function of government and the individuals who serve as public servants. And so I think that was, I'm very happy that I attended that meeting. It was not as popular with some people as it was with others, but I think those are the sorts of things that we need to be doing, because if I have to be willing to sit down and have a conversation and better understand, and frankly, I do better understand the situation. It doesn't make it any easier, but hearing directly from someone's mouth what it is that he's then advocating for with other people, I think it certainly helped my understanding of the situation, or my lack of understanding of the situation, quite frankly, because for me it is just fundamental that we need a government that functions, and I think that everyone in elected office, no matter what branch of government or who elected you or from where, has a vested interest in ensuring that we have a properly functioning government. But I do hope that we reach a point where we can come to the table on this. I think a major goal for many people is that we reopen the government and then have a set period of time in which we commit to coming to some sort of deal on border security. That will be a larger discussion, and I think it should be. And quite frankly, I am very opposed to the notion that we can use federal employees in the very function of government as a negotiating tool. I think that it is offensive to me as a former federal employee, and I think that it's an abdication of kind of Congress's and the White House's responsibility to just have hard conversations about things. I mentioned I've co-sponsored a number of bills. I was an original co-sponsor on a bill that one, gives back pay to federal employees. Now there's talk about how we can help contractors. Another is a bill that would, in the case of a government shutdown for the remainder of the 116th Congress, withhold payment from members of Congress, which I've personally opted to have my salary withheld. For the remainder of the shutdown. But because the constitutionally, Congress can't impact its own salary, so this bill that we sponsored would withhold salaries for the remainder of the 116th Congress, and then into future Congresses, if there is a shutdown on both the House and the Senate side, members would lose their pay for any time there is a shutdown, because I fundamentally believe that if you are willing to put the salaries of other people on the table, you should put your own there right along with it. I've also been a long supporter of the No Budget, No Pay Act, which is a bill that gets introduced time and time again. The basic fundamentals are we cannot continue to run our government with these continuing resolutions because nobody wants to have hard conversations about long-term budgeting and planning. And so there's a bill that gets put forth year after year called No Budget, No Pay, which basically says if members of Congress don't do their most fundamental role, which is budgeting, and approving a budget for the government, that they don't get their pay until that budget is in place. And so I don't believe we've introduced one yet in the 116th, but I know that that's coming, and that's something in principle that I firmly support, because again, we need to make sure that people are doing what it is that they were elected to do, and one of those things is ensure the very function of the government and not use these sorts of kind of political games to the detriment of our functioning. I don't have an answer for how quickly it's going to end. I'm horrified that the shutdown continues into this week. This was supposed to be a district week for us to be back in our districts, but I'm actually headed back to Washington right after this. So we'll be voting again. There was one bill that was vacated. If any of you saw, I don't know if you watch C-SPAN in your free time, but we voted to reopen the government, but there was a little bit of a mix-up where it voted with bipartisan, it passed with bipartisan support, but the Republican leadership meant to call for a voice vote. They didn't, and so it got recorded as a unanimous voice vote, which they weren't happy about. So the Democratic leadership agreed to vacate that vote, and so we'll be re-voting on that one. So that'll be our 10th time, 9th bill of record to reopen the government. And I'm hoping that, the president took a step forward this weekend, I think, and had a little bit of a departure from some of the things that he's been saying previously, most notably that a wall to him is not 2,000 miles of a concrete structure. And so where we can talk about fencing and physical barriers and, ideally have law enforcement personnel from Customs and Border Patrol and other, I used to work narco trafficking across the southern border with CIA, so intelligence officers that can tell us kind of what are the current threats and how many hundreds of tunnels have been found along the existing miles of fencing that we have. Those sorts of things I think will be help perhaps move the situation along. But I think it's fundamental that however it is that we commit to it, we need to reopen the government immediately, and then separate from that, I think that the Democratic Party should be willing to commit to a time frame in which we actually come to the table and have the conversations related to border security that many of our Republican colleagues, and in particular the president, want to have. And I think that those conversations are being had in the public sphere, so we do need to make sure that we're making good movement on that. And there was a good bipartisan bill back in 2013 on the Senate side that didn't get a vote on the House side. By all accounts, that would have passed in the Senate, or excuse me, in the House had it come to the floor. There's been a lot of movement on this, but it's never actually kind of moved the full way. So hopefully that's something that we can change, because at this point we have to.
Great. Thank you so very much
you.
for being with us.